Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joe Madden, and welcome to our Vivit Western User Group virtual lunch and learn around RPA and beyond the basics. Eric, you want to go slide? So again, my name is Joe Madden. I'm founder and president of Greenlight Group, and I'm a co-leader with Stephen Holst from Bass Pro Cabela's and running the Denver chapter. Slide. I'll also be today's moderator. Okay, keep going. So today's presenters, we have myself, Paul Bratlin, who is an SA with focus on ADM with Micro Focus, has been here roughly with Micro Focus for about 3 years, and prior to that, very deeply exposed with ADM solutions across as a customer from a customer perspective. Eric Fisher and I go back quite a long ways. He is ex-Opsware and has been a mentor to me in our automation practice and as we've grown. And then I have with me as well Chris Monroe, employee number 3 with Greenlight, who is one of my senior architects with a specific focus around the automation space. Slide. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. This is a live session. It's being recorded. Recordings will be available to all Vivit members. And then with the Q&A, we ask that you please type the questions in the question pane, and we'll go from there. Next. So this is GoToWebinar. So just a quick, basically type your questions here. Really, I think we won't go in audio mode, at least I think that's the plan. So we really do ask that your questions get typed in here, and we will try to answer the questions on the fly. Obviously, we want this to be an engaging and communicative session. So again, just put questions there, and throughout the sessions, we'll try to address those, as well as in the end when we close this up. Next slide. So first, a little bit about Vivit. For those of you that are joining and are not a Vivit member, I just wanted to share with you what our community is all about. Vivit's an independent, not-for-profit service organization that represents the broad Micro Focus community globally and is endorsed Micro Focus Software's user group. So Vivit's mission really is to serve the community through advocacy, community, and education. For over 2 decades, Vivit's been the unbiased, trusted, field-tested user community for thousands of HP, then HPE, and now Micro Focus software customers. Through acquisitions, our scope has expanded from the original OpenView to include Mercury, Peregrine, Opsware, Vertica, as well as the whole legacy Micro Focus folks as well. Developers, partners from around the world and from all areas of business and industry. So with the merger of HP and Micro Focus, once again, Vivit's here to help our members attain maximum benefits from their investments in the Micro Focus software domain. The agenda here is really, so first of all, the idea of this is, I've been calling it internally RPA 201. So the idea here is, in doing this with Vivit, is the expectation is we have end users that are either ADM and or ITOM folks. And so this is really beyond the basics. We're going to get into the weeds and some best practices, some technical aspects of it, as well as kind of, I believe, Eric, RPA 2020-08 just MR'd last Thursday or Friday. So there'll be a little bit of demo, some talks around best practices, and some use cases in depth that we'll talk to as well. But before we move on, let's do a couple poll questions just to help us. We've got quite a large group of attendees, so we just want to kind of get a sense of who's in the crowd. So first question is, are you a current Micro Focus customer? Yes, no. Okay, I think we should be able to make these go quick. So, oh, we lost the screen. Okay, interesting. So a large percentage of non-current Micro Focus customers. All right, so next question. So those of you that are Micro Focus customers, are you ADM, ITOM, or both? Again, looking for an understanding of the spread of the technical resources backgrounds that we have. A couple more seconds, then go ahead. Oh, that's surprising. So a little heavier on the ITOM versus ADM side and a significant group of both. So that's good. Last question. So are you currently using an RPA solution? And this is for everyone, so Micro Focus customer or not. Okay, let's wrap that up. Okay, interesting, Eric. Okay, so Eric, I'm going to cut over to you and you can go and dive into what's new with RPA 2008 and go from there.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Joe, for the introduction. So we do want to cover a little bit about what's new in RPA, but for those of you that aren't familiar with RPA in general or our implementation of it, I just had a couple of slides to kind of talk about that pretty quick, and then we'll show you kind of some of the new things that are really interesting to us. So for those of you that are not aware, so RPA or robotic process automation is really a mechanism to create automated, let's call them bots, to replicate human actions to produce workflows that do business and IT and to some extent even testing, end-to-end processes to give you the equivalent of an easy button that you can go and hit and execute and have it, and run an entire end-to-end process. So when we talk about, RPA, there's multiple different kinds of it. There's, desktop centric, and there's, server centric, and attended mode and unattended mode. And really what we're talking about in this particular context is what we call enterprise class RPA for doing unattended and attended mode, automations. And with that, you get the capability of recording those actions and creating, repeatable, reusable little, robots, if you will. And it gives you the ability to design workflows to automate the entire end-to-end process, not just one part of it. And probably most important when you start talking about enterprise class RPA is the ability to run this for mission critical tasks, 24 hours a day without interruption, making sure that you're taking into consideration data protection, security, and auditability. When you start looking at RPA use cases, there's a million out there. In fact, I think the last one of the last blogs that I was reading specifically about the industry is there's something where around 584 or so identified use cases in companies that are suitable, and I'm sure that's just an estimate and it's going to go up and down based off of the trends, but just to give you a sampling of some of that, right? It affects every kind of company out there. It affects every line of business within companies, and there's use cases across the board. Whether it's in accounting, you've got automated tasks for end of month payroll activities, or in HR, you might have a new hire onboarding script, which at the end here, Chris and Joe will be talking about an onboarding process that they've actually created for their own company using this technology. Insurance and sales, where you're doing kind of ongoing care and feeding of your environments, so monthly reports, quarterly reports. How do I pull data from multiple environments, multiple tools that were never designed to work together, older tools that have Java or mainframe interfaces where you just don't have some sort of a programmatic interface, yet you still want to bring this together. So really what sets aside or sets apart Micro Focus in the RPA space is kind of these four. There's others as well, but when we talk about high level differentiators, it kind of boils down to these four key areas. The first is we've worked very hard to create a very easy to use interface, what we call codeless or near codeless design. So you don't need to know any programming language. It's all graphical interface driven, drag and wire. So if you can use Visio, you really can use Micro Focus's RPA product. A built-in recorder and some new capabilities that we've just introduced around some advanced activity recording. And then we include a self-service portal for being able to extend those automations to anybody that has permission to launch them, and allow them to launch them without having to even log into the RPA interfaces. You can use our catalog to do that. You can publish these through, to your own service catalog. You can expose them through a command line or an API so that your other applications can take advantage of it as well. Second thing is this notion of resilient robots. If you're a UFT customers, you probably know what we're talking about here. In the industry, it goes by a couple different terms, whether it's intelligent object recognition or AI, The idea is you want an automation tool when you're recording, not to be hung up on the X and Y coordinates that the mouse is moving across the screen. That if you click on a submit button, that if the submit button moves around on the screen or it grows in size or the aspect ratio of your web browser changes, that you don't have to continuously reprogram your recording. And that's really important as you start using and maturing it. You don't want to spend half your time recording or re-recording old processes when minor changes happen, or a user logs in with slightly different permissions and they see the interface a little bit differently. The third is we are combining the power of user interface and programmatic interfaces into one automation workflow. So regardless if it's a graphical interface or some sort of a command line driven or mainframe or web or an SAP client or a Java thick client, whatever technology you have, we can actually adapt to create a single workflow for that and marry that with the thousands of content packs and integrations that we have out of the box for things like Office 365 or SAP, Oracle databases, et cetera. We're constantly modifying, maintaining that, upgrading it, et cetera. So the last count, there's somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 modifiers, objects, calculators, content packs, accelerator packs, et cetera, that are available in our online marketplace and ship with the products. And then the last differentiator is really, we've designed this thing from the ground up to be secure by design. So how do I protect data at rest? How do I protect it while it's in motion? How do I ensure that users don't get access to sensitive information or be able to reverse engineer a process to understand how you're exposing access to the underlying integrations? And that's pretty critical. And tracking the usage in real time as far as how long each of the processes are taking, who's executing them, what the success and failure are, and things like that, and be able to use that for either an audit trail for an auditor that might want to know, if you're an ITIL organization, for instance, are you actually following ITIL in every step? Or if you're some sort of either ISO certification that requires you to follow specific processes, are you following those processes consistently? And this gives you that audit trail to, prove to others, yes, you are following ITIL or ISO or whatever the standard is that you're having to follow. And, data is maintained, it's secure, and available. So, you're going to see a little bit of this as we get into the demo, but there's four main components. There's the activity recorder, which we have kind of a simple recorder and then an advanced mode, depending on what it is you're trying to do. The advanced mode is a new feature we're introducing in the latest version. So it's pretty exciting to be able to see all the new capabilities that we have available for the recorder. This notion of a designer is a web-based application, allows you to drag and wire your entire end-to-end process together and kind of maintain what your flow looks like, what your integrations are, what your variabilization of all the different data is that you're trying to move through the flow, and it allows you to integrate with your source code repository system. So whether it's Git or some other tool to be able to track all the changes that you're making to your workflows and be able to store those so multiple users can take advantage of the content. And then we've got orchestration, which is how we glue everything together. And finally is the robots, which are really the meat behind an RPA solution. We have a highly scalable robot architecture with a message queuing service that allows us to scale to potentially thousands of robots to be able to do thousands of things at the same time. Just a quick sample of some of the thousands of integrations we have out of the box. This list, as I mentioned, is growing and changes quarter by quarter. So it's not realistic to show the entire list, but it is available on our online marketplace if you're curious. So where do we come? And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, just to say, look, this was an idea that our customers brought to us. We took the best of what we knew around functional testing and interacting with graphical interfaces, and that's an experience that we've had over the last 20 or so years, and we've merged that with our enterprise class orchestration product called Operations Orchestration. Our customers actually brought this to us about 4 or 5 years ago. We had a couple of scenarios. One we'll talk about towards the end of the meeting here today, but as one of our use cases. The idea is, hey, I want to orchestrate and I want to automate user interfaces and I want to do these long running processes that do full end process. How do I bring all that together? So we spent the last few years trying to bring all this together, very successfully so. The product officially launched about a year ago. It was July last year. And happy birthday to RPA. It actually is celebrating its 1-year birthday with tons of success. And we're pretty excited about where we've come in the first year. And launching a new product in a new space is always kind of a challenging place, but we all feel that we did a really good job of getting it to market, working through the 1.0 things that weren't quite ready for all of our customers, and cleaned up a whole bunch of stuff. So over the last, we had a release certainly in July last year, another one in November, February, and then the one we're just releasing this week. So what comes with the latest release? We called it 2020-08 because it was supposed to originally launch a couple weeks ago. There was some things that weren't quite ready, so it was delayed a couple weeks. And so there's the August release that was released in September. But it includes a brand new ROI dashboard that we've been working on for a couple of years. It takes some advanced analytics around how the flows are running and provides these to you. It gives you some real meaningful information around how your flows are performing and how much value you're getting out of the product. For those of you that are familiar with UFT, we are now 100% feature parity to UFT 15. In other words, everything that UFT can do, we can absolutely do. We're not using an older version. We're not hiding the UFT interface. So from an advanced editor perspective, you actually can get into all of the features and power behind that 20-year development path that UFT's been on. We have the ability to be a little bit more definitive on where your tasks are run. So if you have 1,000 robots, you want to group them up by location, by skill set, by task, a lot more capabilities around overriding and being specific around what robot node that you're going to execute your tasks on. Some really cool features around introducing code without you having to know code. So functions and filters that are kind of out of the box, you just kind of point and click to them. I'll show you really quickly in the demo. So you get an idea of what they're look like, but just know it gives you advanced capability again without having to learn a programming language or do anything special. And then finally, for those customers that are looking to experiment with RPA, we rebuilt the installer in the last few months, so it makes it very easy to install in kind of a trial mode or simple installation. So to give you some screenshots, and again, you'll see this in the demo, this is the new ROI dashboard. We got the pop out now for the Activity Designer over on the right. So as you're working with a workflow and you need to make some advanced changes to the designer, and again, I'll show you that really quickly. And then finally is the new installer, which is actually really attractive looking to begin with, includes some getting started videos and helpful information to get started. So with that, assuming I didn't get disconnected, I'm going to go into my demo environment. So this is a single instance that I have where everything is installed in the same environment. So you might see me do multiple different kind of persona-related activities kind of in one screen, and that's because everything is one place. So to start off, this is the new dashboard. I'm not going to really spend too much time in here, just to let you know that every time this is real-time analytic information that you program into this. So if your process, your business process to do an HR onboarding used to take you an hour and a half to run, and now through automation it takes you 20 minutes, then you can program in the time savings, or you can even program in the dollar savings. You're going for an hour and a half, and what is that full-time equivalent employee cost versus almost a near zero cost around automation. So how many bots do you have deployed? How many bots are active? How many hours saved versus dollars saved? How long your bots have been running, and things like that, all exposed. And this is highly customized. So if you want to, have a dashboard that's specific to your own use cases and how you're using the product, you can actually customize this dashboard however you see fit. Each one of these little modules, just to click on it, you can kind of see, you can configure, duplicate, move these around on the screen. So if you care about the most popular flows a little bit more than your hours saved, you can move that up into the screen. I'm going to move that aside and go to our designer because I want to show you this really quick here. Well, we've got a few minutes left in my session. Yep.
Eric, let me interject just a couple quick questions. One is, what is meant by a bot? I noticed that on the screen there, and that's one question we get asked a lot. So can you talk to that really quickly?
Yeah, appreciate that, Joe. So a bot, in short, is basically a recording that lets you do a specific task. It's designed to be kind of over and over and over again. So if you think about an assembly line at an auto manufacturing plant, a bot would be the equivalent of that robot arm that picks up the wheel and attaches it to the axle and bolts it on, right? It is a single purpose, it has a motion, you pre-program that motion. Once the motion's programmed in, you tell it what to do, it just does it. And so, you can have large bots that do multiple different tasks, or you can actually create, smaller, more modular ones that you can, reuse a little bit more often. And as an example, I'll just bring one up here on my screen. Oops. This happens to be for a website called Vantage Online Shopping, which is a fictitious web app. But this happens to be a bot that we've programmed for buying an item. So that goes to the website, it logs in, it clicks around into the cart. You can see each one of these there's a navigation, a click, a set, and you can see what it's setting. It's setting the username, it's setting the password, and the password's hashed out. So this is effectively what that bot is how do I create something that's a micro part of your overall process that is very repeatable. You can plug this in, use this in different contexts. And so that's what a bot is.
Okay, and then a couple quick questions. Does the installer support newer OSs? So I'm going to assume Windows 2016, Rail 8, things like that.
Yeah, in fact, actually, so the product itself installs in a Windows environment, and and I didn't share it because I didn't think it would be interesting to most people, but it is, we just certify this latest release to install onto the latest Windows 2019 server. So it installs into 2012, 2016, 2019, and for trial perspective, if you want to install on your own Windows 10 desktop, you can do that as well. Backend database can be, I believe Postgres is supported. I know Microsoft SQL's, Postgres is supported, Oracle is supported, and Microsoft SQL is supported for a backend database.
Okay. And then a question around whether whether RPA is a separate tool from UFT, or is it just new functionality within UFT?
So it's both and neither at the same time. So UFT and OO have we've taken the code that's important for RPA, extracted it, built a purpose-built wrapper installation, all the components, everything you need to do an RPA use case is here. In fact, for those customers that have been using UFT for a long time and have wondered about putting those scripts into production, this is the way you do it, because we provide all of the health and the availability and the logging and everything else required to actually put that use case into production. All the scheduling and availability management, all of that is built into RPA. So now you can actually, when I said both and nothing at the same time, everything you've already developed for UFT, or for that matter in operations orchestration, you can use that content in RPA. So literally it is just importing it in. In fact, when you create new content, it will ask you, do you want to record something brand new, or do you want to import this from UFT?
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Yep, not a problem. And so really recording a process is pretty straightforward, right? You hit the record button, you type in, I've got a new AOS order, whatever. I've got a flow name that says, I'm going to call it new order. Hit OK. It's going to start my recorder. I actually set it up so it's going to open the AOS website in Chrome. So the first thing it's going to do once it creates my shell project is it's actually going to open up the recorder. And then when I hit the record button, it's going to actually log me directly into my AOS application. One of the unique things about the recorder is when you set it up what you're trying to automate, it will literally ignore everything else that's going around. So I can go into click around in Windows and change my tabs, and this will not record anything. It's not a video recorder as well, so it doesn't record things like timing. So I can take as long as I need to click on things and do what I need. So I can be very specific on my tasks. So in this case, we want to do something like shop now, and we want to scroll down, and you can see on the right, I've got an action that just happened. We want to add this to my cart. I want to click on checkout, and let's just view my cart, and we'll just call that the end of my process. So a very simple 5-step process. I'm going to hit done. It's going to close up my browser for me, and then it's going to put those 5 steps that I just created into my screen here in just a moment. And there we go. So now from here, I can variabilize this. I can move things around. I can see what I've done. I can, and this is one of the things I wanted to share with you. If I go into my expression editor, this is my functions manager. So if I had a variable called product, and if I select that, go to my functions, create new functions. Well, now I've got a bunch of functions. I can prepend information. I can do a replace. I can take my variable. If a variable is upper and lowercase, for instance, I can convert the whole thing to lowercase or uppercase just by saying, okay, whatever is in my variable, I want to convert the whole thing to uppercase. And it will substitute whatever I pass into that value, and it's going to make the whole thing uppercase. And when I save that, now I've got a variable called product. It's going to convert it to uppercase. So every time I inject information in here, it's going to make that uppercase for me. Now, if I want to edit this, and let's just go back to something a little bit more interesting. This is that workflow I popped open the first time, a full end-to-end robot for buying a product. If I hit the edit button, this is one of the things that's really new for us, and really I think we've done a good job of introducing this. Again, if you're used to UFT, then this is going to be phenomenal. If you're not used to UFT, UFT is a very, very, very powerful solution for creating screen-centric recordings. As I said, built-in AI and other capabilities. So if we take a look at that action, this is the script that I actually wrote, but we actually have a way to visualize that a little bit cleaner for most people. So we got our tasks that we're trying to create. Kind of every one of these is a different step that's been taken. We got what operation was taken in that step. So we've got a number of clicks. We've got some sets, set secure. And then we've got the documentation of what it actually did. So it clicked in the tablets link, it clicked on the, so if I need to, do a string substitution to, substitute, I don't want this to be specific and click on this, and I want to variabilize this and give maybe a drop-down menu to my order form, I can actually variabilize this whole thing end to end, and this product that I'm clicking on is something that I can inject into it. So now I can reuse this to order any product, not just the HP Elite pad that's here. And then once I'm done, I make all my changes. If I need to, I made a mistake, I want to delete one of these steps and re-record it, I can actually do that right from here. I can test it out and play it. I can insert, interruption steps for testing. I can re-record parts of it or add new steps at the very end, just either by, I can type out what it was that I was trying to do via this model. I can type it out using this. So if I actually want to, do a code change, I can actually change the code right here. If I want to actually change it through, recording that step over again and re-recording where I'm clicking, I can actually hit the record button and insert that new recording exactly where my cursor is. When I'm done with all my changes,
yeah, there's a question, and I think the ADM folks and the audience should be picking up on this, and this is a huge improvement in this version of this tool where it's embedded and it's part of this. You're not having to instantiate a separate instance of UFT, but a question was asked, can we insert weights? Can we do things along those lines? Chris and Paul, I know Chris, well, both of them are going to talk to this in more detail, but this should give a sense of, those of you that are UFT guys, all the functionality that of UFT will transcribe directly to the RPA solution.
And I will say this.
So let me jump. Oh, go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to say there's two things. So we've got the simple editor back here, and you can do things like insert weights, very simple, without even having to log into and open up the advanced editor. But you can certainly do them in here as well. So for most tasks, you're actually going to spend it, and you're never even going to open the advanced editor. You'll open this if you need to re-record something, or if you really want to be very specific and intentional around something that maybe this, the basic editor didn't pick up. But for most use cases, you can actually spend it and do the whole thing without even getting into the advanced editor. So things like variabilization, those functions I was talking about, adding sleep states, things like that. But there's a lot more, power, and I'll let Paul kind of jump in on some of the more powerful things you can do in the UFT advanced editor or the RPA advanced editor.
Yeah, and Eric, Julie, let me also hop in real quick on that. Thanks. Yeah, so you, like Eric was saying, you don't have to bounce into the advanced and things like that. But for the ADM folks familiar with UFT, I'll show a little bit in my portion of this. But you can pre-use those existing scripts, right? Or I should say, use those existing scripts and send them over to the RPA folks to use, right? So the idea here is, and you know, the advantage online shopping here, let's say I had to create a user ID, and every day there's a new employee, I got to go in and create a new user ID for that individual, right? The testing script that maybe one of my coworkers have already created to make sure that that create user already works and covers all those bases and things like that, I may not need the whole one, but let's just make this an easy conversation. I can then send that over to the RPA folks, and then they can use that, right? So that same script can be uploaded into RPA and used. So then the maintenance and all that is already kind of done. We know that script works, and then we're getting a lot of benefit from that.
Yep, thanks, Paul. And then, as I said, when you're done here, if you've made your modifications, you're done, you're ready to kind of go back to, you know, building out your workflow. You close this out. It will take a moment to resynchronize the content. Any changes you've made will pop back down here. You've got a read-only pencil there, that goes away. And now any changes that you've made to the environment are reloaded into this, this particular view. So unless there's any other questions, Joe, actually, that's kind of what I wanted to share. Actually, I'll show one more thing really quick, and that's, you know, how do I apply this to a workflow? And very simply, as simple as you need to, or as complex as you need to. This is just that recording I just showed you. And, you know, when it's done, it goes out to your success step. You can have this string into another, you know, bot, into another bot. So if you're thinking about an HR, you know, new hire onboarding flow, you may have a recording to create a new email account, and a recording to create a new WebEx account, and a recording to create, you know, a new Active Directory, you know, user. And so you're just bouncing from step to step, where you may have an evaluator in there that is looking for a condition of an output. So, you know, if the output is greater than 5 or it includes successful, then take one path. If the output was user already exists, then maybe it's send an email off to your support team, says, hey, we can't create a new user because it already exists in the system. Or reprompt the person making the request saying, hey, this user already exists, you know, do you want to pick another username?
Okay.
So Joe, were there any other questions?
Yeah, I got a couple questions, so I'll give you the easy one first. I don't want to presume. So the question was asked if you're a developer.
Am I a developer?
Yes.
I was a developer 20 years ago. I've forgotten more than I learned.
And then,
Paul, I think you used to be a developer though.
all right. And then, but I think it's a good question in the sense of context, right? I mean, you know, Chris and I both come from more of an operations background. You know, I'm an ex-Oracle DBA, right? So, you know, there's different perspectives in the room. So it's helpful to, I think, hear that.
And I think actually, Joe, to expand on that, that's a very good point that you brought up. This product does not require you to be a developer. It requires you to understand what a variable is, and requires you to understand, you know, a logic diagram so you can kind of move your process through a flow. But you can literally pick this up, and you know, we've got content. This is not all of it, but you know, the base content for, you know, a lot of different stuff. This is, I think, just what comes out of the box, and not even what you can download from our site. You know, so network operations, LDAP operations, I can literally, if I have an operating system, let's say Windows, you know, get active users, I literally just drag this in here. I can look at what this thing does, all the inputs and the responses, and I can, you know, wire this into the process, decide what my input should be, and I can build this process again without knowing any code. We really do consider this to be a codeless, you know, type of product. That said, if you are a developer and you want access to the code, well, we actually expose all of that, and you can manage this. We actually provide you all the markup language, so you can import this in your favorite developer tool, and actually make changes in code right within, you know, the markup language that we provide. When you save that, it reopens to the interface, and you can, you know, so you can have kind of a dual authoring mode where you got some coder and some non-coder, you know, code working on the same project.
Okay, and then a question that's been sitting here for a while that I wanted to give you time to get through your piece, but you and Paul, I'm sure, answer this question all day. Yeah, if the customer is a current UFT or current OO customer, is there still something to buy, and what's the context, and how does that work?
Yeah, so there's absolutely something to buy. So this is not a free upgrade or something like that. It is a net new product. It is the same underlying language. And the reality is you're not going to abandon UFT and move to RPA. There's separate use cases, separate environments. So the UFT licenses you already own, you're going to continue to use those for UFT tasks. RPA is a very specific set of use cases outside of pure testing, outside of some orchestration. That being said, we are always looking at different promotional type things. I know we are working on some upgrade products that we'll be launching hopefully by the end of the year. So if you do own operations orchestration, for instance, that you can just pay to upgrade your OO, your orchestration product into RPA. That's not final yet, so I don't have any details, but that's the kind of thing. But simply put, the way that RPA is licensed today, and we're introducing some new models in the future, but right now is based on the number of concurrent workflows. So if you're starting off small and you want to start with like a 5-pack of concurrency, then you can buy 5. It's the price includes support, and it's relatively inexpensive. You install it on a single or 2 or 3 node environment. You can get going, and if you buy 5, essentially when the 6th flow gets launched, it'll sit there and wait until one of the slots opens up. We'll be doing things like adding burst capabilities shortly, so that if you have an end of month project and you just want to buy a bucket of hours for doing unlimited concurrency for doing an end of month project, then you can buy 500 hours, or I think we're talking about a 750 hour pack that you can add on to your license.
Okay, Paul, you got any other angle on that?
No, he covered the bases. I'll add a couple more when we get there. But yeah, from UFT, your UFT license is your UFT license, then RPA will be a separate one.
Okay. Another quick question, really good question actually. So I'll read it exactly. I'm on the automated UFT site. Who would be the end user for RPA? I'm going to give a spin on that question too, but I'll let you two guys.
End user is hard to define because it's really you're talking about 2 different personas. You've got the RPA process owner, so the person that says, I'm going to actually log into the tool, I'm going to be the one that creates the automation, and they may work with subject matter experts because maybe one of your steps is to go into your SAP system and to create a new user or to run a report. And if you're the process owner, don't know how to do that, you may call somebody over and say, hey, can you do this for me while I hit record, and you just run your process and then we're done. So that you've got that persona. And then you've got the other persona, which is the person that actually is going to get value out of this. And these are typically people that are not trained in the technology. And a great example is, and again, using HR, continue down that path. Your HR person that's handling new hires and onboarding, they don't need to be trained in RPA. They just know they have a 20-step process they want to kick off to create a new user in all your IT systems. They go to a catalog, place the order button, fill in some, what's the user's initial password, what's their username, what's their email, just going to be a hit submit. So now you've given the process to somebody to go execute it without having to actually train them through the entire process. We have a fantastic example of this in our own finance organization at Micro Focus. We had somebody that every day when they got to work, they spent 20 minutes in their job, because we're an international company, was to download the latest exchange rates from the Bloomberg application that we have. So they log into Bloomberg, they export the exchange rates into a CSV file. They take that CSV, they make some modifications, they remove the countries they don't care about, the currencies they don't care about, and they re-upload that into our Oracle finance solution. They run a test transaction to verify the data was imported correctly and the exchange rates look good. They're done. That used to take 20 minutes by somebody trained and certified in both tools to go run through that process. Now, every day, this runs like clockwork on a schedule, 6 days a week. It takes 3 minutes for automation and 0 people are involved in that. So 100% automated. So that person that was doing that 20-minute task, if they go on vacation, they don't have to find and train their backup. They don't have to make sure that that task is covered while they're out of the office. Either they're sick or taking PTO time.
Okay. All right.
And I'll add a couple of there too, Joe. What I like to tell people when they ask this question is, think about anyone, or even in your personal life or at the work life, anybody that has this boring, repetitive task, right? So, hey, Eric's covered it on HR. There's a new user, new hire, right? They got hired in, and you're on the automation side, right? So they need access to these 7 different devices or 7 different environments, or this production this, but they need QA that, and they've got to fire off emails, find out the right thing, blah, blah, blah. And then whoever finally gets it, they have to open up that email and find out, oh, Eric is asking permission into the production environment. I need to get these 5 people to approve it. I need to send those 5 people. You can imagine this whole long process chain, right? All that is time consuming and sucks for that individual. Now, if we can automate that, including the firing off of those emails and things like that, and streamline it into a self-service environment, now when Eric gets hired and says, his boss can say, hey, you need access to production, development, integration, whatever, and you need access to application A, B, and C. Here's a self-service website. Go ahead and fill that out, and then go ahead, as that person's filling it out, the RPA kicks off in the background and walks through the entire process without someone having to babysit it. So when you're asking who's the end user here, really what it boils down to is, if there is something at your work that you do, or that you know somebody has to do, that's boring and repetitive and just, it's the same thing over and over and over and over, we probably can help you out with an RPA script to do that.
Okay, Paul. So, Eric, those are good answers. I think you covered it pretty well. I think the only thing that I would add to it is just, and I don't want to pigeonhole this, but we tend to think of RPA, or at least the way we tend to promote it with our customers, is we're really transcending IT, and it's really more in the business side of the domain, right? So, a lot of Eric's examples are, and again, some use cases will show there's IT's as part of it, but really ultimately you're trying to get to an automated process leveraging the UFT functionality to be able to do repetitive tasks, right? And typically it's really more around business type things. Not to say that it can't be done in IT, or you can't do IT tasks, right? I mean, we wouldn't necessarily go out and do a recording of someone going into vCenter and building or cloning a VM and, yada, yada. Technically you could, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. But most of the conversations and most of where we're having, focused on are processes that are interact with IT, but are typically outside of IT proper, and the value of it is outside of IT proper. All right, so let's, I think Eric, you're pretty through.
Yep,
now.
I'm done. I'm ready to hand off to Paul, who's going to cover some things around UFT specifically.
Okay, so while you're making that handoff, I want to bring up a couple other questions, Paul, for you to be able to address. The question came up of, can you pump different values for the same RPA test, and how? And then how is test automation different from RPA? I'm going to answer or take a stab at the second one. I'll let you address the different values question. But to me, test automation, really RPA is leveraging the test scripts, the test things that you guys do. But I think most of your focus is around functional testing and the whole CI/CD pipeline type thing. What we're really doing is taking those test scripts and doing a business function process that is, we're automating, right? So onboarding, or moving a file from A to B, or doing some sort of process. The fact that you test for it and have built test scripts is really the lever point for you guys as Micro Focus guys to be able to really quickly adapt to that, right? I mean, there's probably in the SAP domain hundreds of functions that you have to test for and have automated over the years to do this, that we can turn around and leverage and build automation from that. So with that said, I'll let Paul pick that up and the question around how we deal with dynamic values and things like that, and go from there. Right,
yeah,
Paul?
and actually before Paul picks up, one last thing. So I think, a lot of UFT, it's amazing the number of UFT customers I've talked to in the last 6 or so months where they've actually been running UFT in production. So when you do that, yeah, there's a little bit of confusion around, well, if I'm already running in production, how's RPA different? The reality is UFT was never designed to be run in production. So if you are testing something for the purpose of testing, that's what UFT is supposed to be doing. The instant that that test script is used for something that's meaningful or important to the business or to somebody's job or to availability of an application to keep it running, for instance, that's the kind of the transition point from our UFT into RPA, when you need to have that scheduler and kind of robustness, because now when you're counting on it to run, you need to have a scheduler, you need to have a user interface, you need to have the logging capability, you need to have the advanced analytics to understand, is it running correctly? If it fails, retry, and all those other stuff that's kind of wraps around, around UFT. And that's kind of the key difference between UFT and production RPA is as you take those scripts and start doing them for something that's absolutely an important process, not just a testing activity. All right, Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Eric. So what I'm going to do real quick is kind of briefly discuss in a couple of slides what's been new coming down UFT. As you can tell on the screen, this first one's from June 2019, the 14.5.3. Reason why I want to kind of cover this is, one, these are going to be in the slides that are going to be handed out later. So if you see something on this and you want to find out more, it'll be in here, and then you can reach back out and we can have conversations. Another thing that I kind of want to mention before we get too far down the path here, Eric and myself are both solution architects at Micro Focus. Glad to help. So you'll have our contact information, and I know Joe and his group will also love this. Reach out and ask these questions. Also ask within the Vivit group. I've been a Vivit member for, well, a couple of years before coming across. But ask each other for help. I know Graham England's on here, and Graham and I used to work at the last job I have before coming across. Knows a lot of UFT. He's been around it for a long time, just as long as I know. Looking at the list, there's a bunch of other people in here. The greatness of Vivit is you are talking with folks that have probably done the same pain that you're going through, and they might be able to help with that. So without further ado, I'm going to say here's what's new in 14.5.3. 14.5.3 came out in June 2019. It was really the I would say the official launch of our AI capability, which I'll show a little bit more in the UFT side of this. The ability was more on what was on your mobile devices. So, hey, it was an app that ran in there in a browser and things like that. So that really came across in here. Up next, after 14.5.3, came 15.0. 15.0 came out in November of last year and added a bunch of features and functionalities. We enhanced our enhancements around our AI, UFT for Hyper-V, Azure DevOps Server. We refreshed the UI. We added a dark mode for those of us with a little bit older eyes. That makes life a little easier. Updated more of the support, what we support browser-wise and app-wise and things along that nature. Usability, made it easier in the data table to import and export data. And our current version, 15.01, came out in April 2020. We're not done with updating UFT, but just wanted to kind of go through this. Those of us familiar with the HPHPE days, this release schedule that we just showed here from 14.5.3 all the way to 15.01 is dramatically faster than what HPHP did back in the day, right? We used to release we used to release, 1 or 2 major updates a year, and, nobody would really hop on those new ones. Under Micro Focus, we've definitely adapted to releasing as fast as we can to get usefulness to the customer and move forward. So just wanted to point out a lot of the change that Micro Focus has brought into the space for UFT and the ADM space, ALM, Quality Center, Octane, and those sort of things. We're releasing faster. We're releasing better code. I know those of us that used to be ALM admins, you never used to run current, right? You'd always run 2 or 3 versions behind. Under Micro Focus, that's really changed. The code being released is fairly solid and you can use it. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and drop into some, hey, this might be something that pops up for UFT. that you're doing RPA, this is one of those problems that might pop up. How do I solve that, right? And things like that, and kind of best practices and things like that. So I am going to show you my UFT instance on my laptop. So just a bit of background here. What I have on the screen is what I typically see as kind of a first cut for a UFT script, or somebody who's new to it and is like, oh, okay, here's the coding that I did. And like Eric said, this is the Advantage Online Shopping is the website. Mine is a development instance, so that's why you see here this highlighted Nimbus Server 800. So real quick, let me just show you what that looks like. So I'm going to go IE, but this could be Firefox or Chrome or whatever browser to your heart's content. And it's going to say, hey, Paul, do you want to log into the corporate network? And I'm going to say, no, I want to go to this demo environment. So here's the Advantage Online Shopping store. Think Best Buy or anywhere where you can, go out and buy laptops, headphones, whatever to your heart's content, speakers, so on and so forth. I'm going to go ahead and I want to buy something. Well, to buy something, you have to create a new account, right? So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to click new account, and this is going to tell me all the create new account stuff that I have to fill in, right? Everyone's familiar with this. We've done this time and time again, right? So this is the script that, typically bounces around out there, right? So open up a browser, go to Nimbus Server, in this case is the Advantage Online, click the user icon, create a new account, click username, go to the data table, and this is our data table down here. In this case, we're being driven by this. So if I had multiple lines here, it would iterate one time per line through the data table. So find the username value in the global data sheet, and that's this one. In this case, it's going to be username Bratlin2. I want to create Bratlin2. I want to give it an email address of 2@2, give it this password. It wants me to confirm the password, so password2, password2. I'm going to say the first name, the last name, so on and so forth. I'm not going to go line by line here, but just show you what's in here, right? So this script is all coded up to create basically Bratlin2 and give it a password of password2. So if I go ahead and fire this guy off, it's going to go line by line. And again, it's running off my laptop, so it's a little slow because I've got a bunch of things running all over in this, but you can understand the running here. Pulls up the browser, goes to the website, and it's walking through. And for the purposes of this, I'm on one screen, so you guys can kind of see it bouncing forth between UFT and browser. And if you look at the bottom right, or the bottom of my screen, the UFT icon is working through this. It syncs, so now it's doing the click, and now it's going to enter in all those fields. Okay. And it hit register. UFT is in there going, okay. I'm clicking register. I'm waiting for the website to react. Now, like I said, this is running on my desktop, so the entire website for Advantage Online Shop for this purposes is running on my website, so you probably hear the fan going off. Now it's calling the log out action, so it went in and said, okay, click the sign out button and go ahead and close Explorer. So down here, it closed my browser and off it went. So everyone sees my screen. We see this happy little check mark. It said that the Create AOS account run 17 worked. Everything you asked me to do passed, nothing failed, no warnings, life is good, off you go. One of the things I see, and the reason why I'm pointing this out, is everybody now assumes based on this that the Bratlin2 user account got created with username password 2. So if I just went to this website, and I'll do it in Firefox this time just to change it up. I should be able to sign in with Bratlin2. So I'll click Bratlin2, password 2. Incorrect username and password. Well, my run said everything was fine. right? So this is the first kind of tips and tricks for people. One, this is a script that doesn't have any error checking or pass-fail conditions, right? It just does what you tell it to do. So one of the tips and tricks here is when you're creating this, either for RPA or for UFT, right? Yes, it goes through and does everything you told it to do, but there's no confirmation that it checked that it did what it wanted to do, right? All you did was tell it to go click a couple of buttons, enter a couple of things in, and click the register double check button, right? There's no checking to make sure that it actually did that. Does this user ID already exist? Is your password doesn't fit the criteria? All those sort of things aren't in there. So let me go ahead and change scripts real quick to maybe something that has a little bit more error handling and checking in it. And I'm going to cheat and just copy and paste from something I already have. So now same setup, right? Open the browser, go to the URL, click on buttons, fill in certain things, and off you go. The only real addition here that we've added is this. So this reporting event basically says, hey, if you go after you click the register button, the Advantage Shopping that pops up, page Advantage Shopping, web element username already exists. If that exists, report a failure and basically say, hey, action failed because that username already exists. Else, go in here and say, yep, everything was fine. The creation of that user ID was successful. So same setup, Bratlin2, username, password 2, password 2. Now if I run this same script, and the only thing I really added here was this error handling, or pass-fail reporting, I should say. I'll go ahead and run this sucker. And it's going to go away and do its thing. So shortly the screen will pop up and it'll start running. So that's the first kind of tip. If you're doing this for UFT or even for RPA or things like that, as you kind of get past the 101, hey, I made this thing work, right? I just typed in the fields and life is good. Start putting reporting in there and some error handling, like, hey, if the website doesn't respond or that user ID already creates, what do I do, right? That first run that I did, everything passed because according to UFT, I clicked and I hit all the buttons. I didn't do any checking. I just said, hey, click, enter in these fields and then hit the register button. I didn't check to make sure that user ID wasn't already there. This second run, all I've done in there is basically said, hey, if you get this error that shows up on the screen, username already exists, then report a failure back to UFT. That same thing would pass on through RPA. Now, if I was the end user in RPA, for example, and my first script, I could run that thing all day, every day, and create new user IDs, except for if Bratlin2 already existed, like in our case, RPA would say success, that user ID is already existing, off you go. And the user, me in my case, I would have the user ID Bratlin2, but not know the password, right? And that's really where this first kind of pass-through is helping is, oops, and I've got an error on that because I didn't copy and paste properly. So it's going to come back through and show me that the error is there, browser page, web element, user ID already there, and I copied an extra parenthesis. So let me fix that as I'm chit-chatting. Browser, create user ID created. Oops. The joys of a live demo with scripts. So let me go ahead and kick that off. As that's going through, the other thing that I want to mention here is, as you can see in this version of this, I have basically 0 comments, right? So if I was asked my coworker here, Eric, or if Graham, I'm picking on Graham because he deserves all kind of picking on, what this script did, there's nothing there, right? They'd have to read line by line. They'd have to open up the Advantage Shopping. They'd have to listen to the dissertation you just did and what I did. And if I needed help or it's been 3 years and they asked me to update the script, there's no way I'm going to remember what this script did. So the next kind of tips and tricks here is comment your code, right? It sounds silly, but go in there and say, hey, the reason why I created this script is to do X, Y, and Z. The following line does the following things, okay? Those sort of things are very helpful. So as we saw in this script, I just ran it, and now it's saying this failed. So 23 steps passed, but one failed. And the reason why is a nice description saying this thing failed because that username already existed, right? So if you're the end user of this script, think about how much more helpful this is because you now have error handling, or in this case, a pass-fail criteria to report back to folks. So those are kind of those nice high-level tips and tricks, kind of best practices. Comment your code, put some pass-fail criteria in there and things like that. A couple other ones that people new to UFT have an issue with is how to select out of drop-down boxes. So a couple of things here. In this case, and let me go ahead and pop back open to the website so you see where I'm talking about. I'm going to create a new user ID. Okay, so country is a drop-down box, right? And again, this is a demo environment, so you can tell there's 3 Afghans. This shouldn't be this way, but it's my demo environment, and I've broken it really good. But we've got this drop-down box, right? So to interact with that drop-down box, a line like this is how you're going to do that. So in UFT, if you're coding by hand, I guess is the right way of saying it, instead of the record and playback feature, which we'll get to here in a sec, you would do this: browser. What browser am I interacting with? What page in that browser am I interacting with? What am I trying to do? In this case, the country list box register page, the web list for that, select this value. And if I wanted to just make this USA, I could just change this to USA, right? Now, what's nice about this is all this is hard-coded, right? So to Eric's point earlier on, a lot of this should be a variable, and this is really where the data table comes in, and RPA will actually feed that through. So if I wanted to change this, I could go ahead and create a variable and then use this line here. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and not do that. Just want to mention that. To interact with the data table, you go ahead and say, hey, for this field, go to this data table, look up the username, which is the value of this column, and what data table in there. So in this case, it's the global sheet and that. Now, before I get going on to the next one, I just spewed a lot of things out there. Are there questions in this comment or questions around this before I move on to the next one?
I'm sorry, it just dawned on me that people can't ask questions. I think one of the, well, I mean, I'm just looking at questions here. Yeah, Herb's kind of hitting on something we've run into, which is it's not so much setting the value, although that's the ultimate point. It's in those drop downs, it's, you know, managing the object, that drop down object. And I think Herb and I are saying the same thing, that we've run, and it's really not a, it's not a micro focus issue. It's not a UFT issue. It's that, you know, no drop down box is created the same, at least in our, you know, experience in starting to, you know, record these transactions. So can you talk to some of the, you know, the common approaches to that, as far as being able to pick the object and make sure that when you know, you record, you know, that actually plays the value you want, or maybe you feel like you've done that?
Oh, no, yeah. So there's a bunch of different pain points in UFT, and some of the comments in there from different people kind of cover on those, right? So I'm an old QA engineer myself, did some automation for a while, I've bounced around in a couple of different places. So yeah, a lot of the time what we do, and actually what we recommend in the UFT space and just testing in general, is before you do a full-fledged, hey, we're going to test this, is do some spot checking to make sure things are done the way that you think they should be done. So like I said, in my demo environment here, here's an issue, right? There's 3 Afghans, 3 Albanians, American Samoa. This has been tripled up, right? Because again, it's my demo environment. I went in the source code and I basically did a create statement way too many times and created way too many of these sort of things. So kind of the best tips and practices in there is before it even gets to you, build, deploy, things like that, continuous integration, continuous development, running smoke tests constantly. Users have to, developers have to check code in, run unit tests before it gets put into the branch. All those sort of things cover those bases. But what I always recommend, and what we kind of recommend here at Micro Focus, is do some quick checking through here, right? So you can go in here and say, hey, there's our count of countries that we care about is 150. So if I go in here in this drop-down list and count more than 150, then there's no sense going on, right? There's an issue there, and go ahead and go down that path. So there's those sort of things. Does that cover what you were asking there, Herb, or should we dive in a little deeper?
Well, I think his question is asking about dynamic variables, or I know we have had that problem with like our CenturyLink app and things like that. I think Chris talked to that a little bit too, but I don't know if there's anything specific around the dynamic side of it that your explanation didn't cover.
I see what you're saying. So in that case, let's say it's more, and this site doesn't do it, but let's pick on the state and province code. So a lot of good websites that aren't just a demo environment. If I select Finland here, this becomes a drop down that allows me to check states, provinces, or region based in Finland, as opposed to if I select, the United States, then this drop down should do Colorado and things like that. If that's what Herb is talking about, then kind of the best practices there is, and Herb would love to kind of take this, have a one-on-one with you, or even come back to a Vivit conversation and dive in deeper to this. But there's ways around that. One, you can go in there and basically have UFT query the database on what's supposed to populate here. So in this case, if I did United States and this became a drop down, and this drop down is only supposed to have the 50 states in it, and then so on and so forth. You could have UFT, and this is more like 300, 400 stuff. Well, you could have UFT query the database for the correct result set, and go ahead and populate that back, and then you say, hey, okay, select this one, or hey, select the fifth state down, and it should be whatever the alphabetically fifth state is. You can definitely do a lot of that within UFT and do kind of those checks and balances. It really depends on the purpose of the script, right? So if this is just a quick smoke test script, maybe you're only selecting the fifth answer down. If this is more robust to make sure the state is populated correctly when the correct country is done, and you don't trust your database connection, then you can do kind of a database, a data table spot check, right? So you can have in the data table, hey, these are the 50 states that should be populated when I select United States, and do a select one by one through that list. And then if something doesn't show up, let's say there's 51 instead of 50, error off in that report handling.
Okay, that's good. I think we need to kind of cut it off and move on and cover the rest of it, but I think you got the gist of it. I know Herb's kind of comment was around, again, I think a key point here is there's challenges with, 30 years of applications. I mean, a lot of what we emphasize is the web stuff, but just that, depending on the developer and the standards, they may not have taken, approaches that are easily identifiable. And so there's just ways. I think the power of UFT is there's ways to work through that and identify it. It just may go from, algebra to something more complex to be able to capture all that. So Paul, was there any other kind of things you wanted to cover, or are you good?
Yeah, I'm going to do just a quick highlight around AI that might also help solve that same thing. Let me just switch to a quick script real quick. And I'm not going to dive too deep into this because I know in the interest of time, we have other things to kind of cover, but just want to show off what, from a maintenance standpoint, what this might make life easier. So like Eric was saying, this is the advantage of online shopping. Instead of having this from a UFT perspective, I'm going to basically log in and purchase two things and move on. So what I just want to show in this script, and I'm just going to execute it through one time, is instead of those, hey, and maybe this was Herb was leading towards, is, I'm going to go ahead and run here. Come on, wake up. There it goes. What happens if something changes on that page? What if laptop isn't laptop anymore? What if it is notebook, right? What if it's not speaker anymore? What if it's, audio devices? Those sort of things tend to break if it's a drop down or things like this. So all I'm doing in this script is I'm logging in, username and password, Mercury in this case. I'm going to go ahead and click laptop. And sign out. Or sorry, this one's just a log in, log out. My apologies on that. And now I'm going to do the same thing in Firefox, but I'm going to go ahead and kill this, which will cause a whole error to happen. But just wanted to show you how this is slightly different than the code that you are looking in here. And this is more kind of on the robust things of life. But if you look here, hey, after you've logged in, well, let's do a useful one. These are case browser, blah, blah, blah. In interest of time, I'm going to skip that. But this is more the robustness of, hey, if I want to run this against a mobile site versus, if I want to run this versus a desktop versus a mobile site, these are the things that you would do. You'd code in case statements to say, hey, if it's browser, go here. If it's on the device, look to see if the application's installed. And it is still running, even though I told it to stop. So I'm going to try it to stop one more time. There we go. Going to get the result set that says, hey, you told me to stop, so I stopped. But interesting things in here is this AI util find text block. This is a lot easier for someone to pick up and run to say, hey, what are you trying to do? In this case, I'm trying to find if speakers exist on that page. If it does, life is good. If it doesn't, then, something went wrong. And maybe we'll come back on another Vivit conversation and dive into this. But this AI util find text block replaces what those lines of code were before. The browser speakers exists, right? So this one line of code, and then if that speakers changes in the web page, if it changes location with AI util, I can still find where that speaker is. Versus some of the legacy versions of UFT would have a hard time finding that. That's where I probably should wrap up here. So I'll throw it back unless there's any questions.
No, I think we're good. So let me share my screen. We've talked about the overall of RPA. We've gotten some focus around the ADM perspective. Now we're going to dive a little bit into the OO perspective. So let me maximize my screen here. And then Chris, I guess we'll flip that around. Are you ready to go?
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. So like Paul, like Eric, like Joe have been saying, right? Those of you that have come down the UFT path, you've seen that code. That UI isn't necessarily something new. Those of you coming down the OO path, right? And we're used to the Visio diagram, the tying the pieces together, but not really getting into the code. These are some of the things that we've come across, really some gotchas, some tips and tricks on bringing the two together. For legacy OO users that are familiar with the old OO Studio, fat client, load on your workstation, you can build all the flows you want day in, day out. Now we're dealing with a web-based browser. Some of the things that we've run across specifically when it comes to like multi-author environments, right? When you have different developers in and working on their own projects in their own studio, you didn't necessarily have to be as coherent or cohesive as a group. Now with Designer being in a server, everybody connects to the same point. We've run across consistency issues. So just some tips and tricks. Our best practices would be make sure that when you're defining and building new projects, right, as a group, you agree and use a similar structure, right? Consistency in the project structure. Make sure all your actions, your operations, your subflows, your recordings are all in the same categories, same order, same location. So anyone coming in later to pick this up, like, Paul was saying, if you don't comment your code, somebody coming in later is not going to be able to tell what it was you're trying to do or where you're trying to go. So bringing that consistency to a web-based designer is key. It's crucial in making sure that your multiple authors have all the runway that they need to continue to provide that ability. Some of the other things that go along with that, when you take a new recording, create that RPA bot, the robot, for example, when we start variabilizing things and parameterizing those, I found that it's most helpful across the board to create the one simple flow. Eric finished on one of those, but you create a bot and you create a flow to go along with it that assigns all of those inputs, capture all your parameters, all the data points that you need to be able to run that bot and have that be a standalone flow. You can then, using the OO type structure, start stringing those flows together into that bigger picture process. But don't try to create a whole bunch of independent bots and string the bots together into a single flow. It seems to be easier to make one recording, one flow. And then with source control, I know Eric hit on this a little bit. Source control is key when you're branching out and when you've got multiple developers or non-code developers, if that be a real term, to make sure that you follow good practice in, when I first log into RPA, I need to make sure that I go get the latest from the source code repository. So any other authors that have been adding to or updating the projects, updating the recordings, adding variables, I need to make sure that I start with a fetch so that I get the latest, because there's nothing worse than spending all day updating your flows to find out that you were working on 3 revisions old. And then to do the same thing back for other developers, right? Make sure that as you make those changes that you push back to source control, so that we can keep that runway open and let all the developers have all the room to run they need, yet still be able to provide that consistent, clean ROI to the business. If you want to move on to the next. So the other thing that we've come across when you're used to OO, right? In OO Studio, you had the concept of remote debugging. So when we could have a single developer studio, a single design studio, but we could connect it to our development OO and to our test OO and to our production OO, right? As we would build these designs, we could run and we could test in place, test it in dev, use the same UI, test it in UAT, and then again, run it in production when we're ready. We don't have some of those capabilities going into this RPA. I know there are a lot of things in the roadmap, and they're always adding new features for this. But to think about that production lifecycle, or the whole CI/CD pipeline of where we come from with OO Designer and with RPA. So what we find is you set up a single instance of the RPA Designer. To Eric's point, right? You can do an installer that installs all the components: designer, the recorder, the central studio, the bot work engine. Everything can be together, but you really only need the designer components in your development environment. So you build those, you actually create the content, you sync that with your source control, Git, repositories, but then you use that content, you create content packs, and you use the publishable content packs like you would find on Micro Focus Marketplace, and you deploy those to your UAT environment, and you go through the development lifecycle, have end user testing and validation in your non-developer, non-designer environments using that code that you've created in developer mode. Some of the gotchas that we've run into there happen to be when we were trying to work with multiple instances of RPA Designer. And yes, you can sync to the same Git repository. You can bring in all your projects. You can bring in all that workflow work, But one of the things that you get with this combination of OO and UFT in RPA, the UFT artifacts, those actual recording bot objects that are created, they actually don't synchronize with Git. They are stored in Designer, in the actual system. So if you were to take your source control repository, move it over to another RPA Designer instance and open up your project, it would show you that you're missing a lot of dependencies. Like in the screenshot there, you've got that AOS lab, it's got that red underline. There are things missing in that project, and the things that are missing are those UFT recordings. So we have found that you actually want to take, if you are going to use a different instance of Designer, you want to create a content pack, save it as a jar file, your compiled publishable content that includes all the OO work, all of the UFT work, all of your inputs, all of your properties, all of those things in a content pack. You then load that content as a content dependency into a new RPA Designer, and then you can load your source control repository on top of that. If you don't do it that way, you end up running around in circles trying to figure out where all these dependencies were that you just aren't going to get. The other thing that we've also come across is you've got to be conscious of those versions. When you're talking about creating content packs, you can create, every time you do that download content pack, you can set a version number. And if your UFT artifacts don't match the OO flow versions that go with it, you still end up with those dependency conflicts. So just as a way to try to avoid those, right? Again, consistency being key, we want to make sure that we capture all of our projects and synchronize those versions across the board for all those environments. I know I'm probably taking a little bit long. Let's keep going if you want to switch to the next. So the other concept, and Eric has hit on this, I think Paul talked about this as well, is the concept of modular design. You don't want to boil the ocean. You don't want to create a single recording that does everything, every task for the business process. You want to break that down into, a single operation is a recording. If you've got another operation to perform in that business use case, it's another recording. You can then use the OO components to chain those operations together, like you're used to seeing with like that Visio workflow. So you can now have individual test points. If something's broken, you're not trying to rebuild the entire process. You have a simple task that you need to focus on. So separating those into individual, easy to manage, easy to maintain operations rather than entire business process defined as a single recording. We also have the ability, and Eric hit on a couple of these points before, so I won't go into more detail, but the Python expression function editor where you can set your inputs is a great advantage now that we didn't have before in the old Cloud Slang Designer, where you can variabilize your inputs, but then if you have to take, username, set it to lowercase, things like that, you have that expression now that you can use to assist in bridging the gap and tying those together as you start to string those operations together one by one. If we want to move on to the next. So I've already hit on a lot of these points. If you're familiar with the legacy OO Designer versus the new RPA web-based Designer, or one of the later releases of OO also included this web designer module. Some of the things that will get you if you aren't familiar with them are things like that test debug with remote execution doesn't exist in the web designer. So you can debug in the instance that you're on. There isn't a way to call out to a remote, like the old OO central system. So you'll want to make sure that all of your connections are valid from this RPA instance that you're working from. We also don't have things like the old, if you're familiar with them, the assign from or the assign to, where you can pass variables in and out of the different steps. That doesn't exist in this designer. And again, like I said, some of these I've already heard are coming through the pipeline that Python expression editor is one of those things that I would have actually put on this list prior to this webinar, that the inputs you couldn't really edit. And so in the old studio, you had this filter option that you could take an output, you could manipulate all your string comparison or manipulation, and then save that as a new variable to then pass on to the next step. So we're catching up and we're adding a lot of that functionality into the new workflow designer, this RPA workflow designer, but there are still some things that aren't quite there yet. So when you run your flows, you will need to make sure that you capture all of those inputs, capture all of those outputs, and make sure that you have values assigned for everything that needs to be done when you do go through an execution of it, because it won't stop and prompt you for input either, at least at this point in time. Again, a future release, I hear that's coming, where when you hit play and you hit replay, if there is a defined variable that is required that doesn't have a value, you should be able to stop. It'll prompt you. You can put in the information that you're missing and then continue on. And then as codeless or not codeless as it might be, right, there is a language change from those of you that did get back into the code before. If you were to edit an old OO flow, right, it used to be an XML-based file. Now we're talking the markup language is YAML. And then those old filters that you would put on variables, it used to be JavaScript. Now everything that we're dealing with is Python. So a lot of it is codeless, but when you do have to break into the code, you know, a little bit of an understanding of YAML and Python will take you a long way in this new workflow designer as we see it. And then some gotchas when we're trying to run recordings. As we have seen, and Eric showed that, I actually saw Eric was running in incognito mode as well. As good as the recorder is at capturing objects and defining where to go and what, you know, tab or what browser page to launch when you replay the recording, there are some gotchas that we have found. If you run Google and then try to start a recording activity and also run that in the Google browser, then the recorder does tend to have a little bit of trouble identifying which tab to be recording, which tab to maintain. So some of the tricks that we have used are to launch an incognito window to log into the recorder itself. That way, anytime you run a recording, start a new activity, it launches a regular non-incognito window, and there's no question, it doesn't actually have any problem defining the tab to use or where the recording focus should be. And another thing that we've also identified with the run and record settings that you get when you do launch those activities, a lot of times you can go in and you can specify, you know, here's the page that I want to go to. And on an individual project basis, that's okay. But when you have, you know, multiple developers in and somebody's working on, say, the Office 365 steps, somebody else is working on your HR system for time tracking, somebody else is working on your phone system, right? You've got all these different endpoints, and rather than updating the run and record settings again and again to work with them, another tip that I have worked on is you start a new blank browser window and point it just to about blank. It does take one step out of the replay. You lose the first step where it tries to synchronize the content in the browser page. So the recording actually does kick off a little bit sooner. And then your first action in the recording is to make a navigate statement where you go to the page that you're looking on just for that recording. So those are some of the tips and tricks we've found with running recorder and working within this new workflow designer, OO and UFT together. One more, I think I got one more here, just kind of the same thing that Paul was hitting on towards the end. It is codeless. Yes, you can do a lot of your recording, and our small screenshot here on the right gives you that initial recording, no user programming required, right? I point and clicked. I went to the web page, filled out the forms, hit submit, everything's good. But going back to some of Herb's questions and the discussion we had, right? When that codeless isn't enough, right? What do? Well, with the embedded activity recorder or activity designer, which is the UFT interface within RPA, that allows you to go add the additional what I'll refer to as stabilizers that make that replay much more robust, much more consistent. Taking our replay from like a 40% success rate to over a 90% success rate without errors by adding just a couple of simple little coding steps in there. Like you can see here, I've added several wait points, right? Some of those lists are generated dynamically, and we don't have control over that, right? We've got whoever developed the web page. They created whatever they wanted to create. It's not the tool's responsibility to create the page. It's the tool's responsibility to read the page. And we can read a lot of that, but if it's a JavaScript form or a dropdown that doesn't actually exist until you click, like Paul was saying, you click on country and then the state pop-up is created. It's created on the fly or it's created dynamically. The ability to go in and manipulate some of these settings at the UFT level make those recordings much, much more resilient. And so here I've got a couple of places like caching and cookies. When you have to log in to perform an action, you only have to log in once. Well, if you actually have token-based authentication and it's good for X number of days or hours or weeks, you can add those if-then statements and you can say only perform these steps in the recording if you find those objects on the page. If I'm already logged in, don't try to log in. If you try to bring a drop-down box together and sometimes the recorder has a hard time identifying, that drop-down object, you don't have those unique IDs that you need, you can actually change the replay type. You can go back and forth between looking for browser objects or using mouse events. Sometimes the point and click really is still the way to go. And then sometimes, like you said, if you can't go to a specific element in a list because you don't have the unique ID, right? Like line 15 there in that screenshot, you can select object number 3, right? Select the third element in the list. You don't need to know what the values are in some cases. And that helps you take that recording from okay, it works most of the time, but there were those use cases where this wouldn't work or that wouldn't work. Just adding a couple of lines of code here and there to make that recording much more resilient really is the only word I can come up with. We've taken our recordings a long way just by doing a couple of those little simple additions to the recording. Save it, and then we can tie those together using the OO workflow, stitch one subflow to another subflow and pass those inputs and outputs along to end up with your entire process that just works.
Okay. All right, Chris, thank you very much. That's good stuff. I kind of liked how you and Paul overlapped on some of the things, and a lot of where Chris and our perspective comes from as ops guys and OO guys, not being ADM, UFT guys. It's been some things that we have learned that kind of help make this solution work more smoothly and more, the word that we use is resilient. I realize we're over. We have probably about another 10 minutes. Just use cases from Eric and I. Can I get a quick raise of hands if you're okay, or we can drop from here? But let's make it a quick, raise of hands if we'll just continue. Okay, I think we're going to continue. So, Eric, if you got to go, we respect that. We'll follow up with links and coupons for the lunch. But Eric, why don't we go with you and your use case around mortgage stuff here. So let me go to the next slide here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got a few time, so it's not a problem for me. All right, so this is one of our oldest use cases. And the reason we like to talk about it is it actually is very telling on a number of challenges that customers are facing when they're looking at RPA. So this was a bank. In fact, actually, this was one of the customers that brought the whole idea of RPA to us. And they initially did this with operations orchestration and UFT and kind of glued it together on their own. But what they did is, they were challenged with, you can see the challenges here on the left: inefficient processes, slow time request. What their business was is, if you have a home mortgage with this Australian bank, which in Australia, your mortgage is more than just where you pay for your bank or you pay for a home. what happens is that most of your financial transactions happen from your mortgage in Australia. Your paycheck goes directly to them, and you pay your other bills out from there, and whatever's left at the end of the month, automatically kind of pays down your house. They actually believe that you can save a ton of money on your interest by doing this. The problem is, if you need to make changes to the account, you want to change, your employers, you want to change your overdraft, you want to change, where you're making payments to and from, required calling in or going into a web form, making some changes. It was a huge amount of process behind that. So by and they spent millions of dollars, no joke, but millions of dollars in trying to automate, the different disparate tasks with no meaningful return, to the cost of how much it was taking to run this part of the business. So after implementing an RPA solution, in the first 2 months, they were able to make changes to 15,000 loans, which is, to give you an idea of kind of the scale of what they were trying to solve for. So they weren't trying to create 20 different use cases. They focused on literally 2. And these were big ones and meaningful ones. In the first year, those 15,000 loan variations turned into 120,000 days of customer wait time. And I'll get into a little bit of why in just a moment. And really resulted internally of over 11,000 hours of manual processing time change. So Joe, if you will go to the next slide, but don't fully build this out, just one step at a time. Advanced. All right, so this is what the process looked like to start with. Everything was buckets of automation in here to do various tasks, but it was a series of manual handoffs. So a request comes in to make a change, the change is printed out and processed. Somebody checks it, manually this information to make sure it's coming from the right account. They call the bank that they're trying to do this transfer from. Is it, the account under the right name? Right, manual verification and vetting, and they bundle all this stuff together. They send the forms to an offshore processing facility that does all the data entry, that makes all the actual changes, and it comes back onshore, for the final data handling and notification of the customer. Advance to the one click, Joe. And to measure that took 2 weeks. So from the time that you called in or submitted a request to make changes to your account, it took 2 weeks for them to go through this entire process. And again, it's because of all the manual handoffs and everything else. Joe, next. So they implemented an RPA solution that basically automated the entire thing end to end. Not only did they shrink, the number of steps because they're doing all this in automation, not only did they go from 14 days to 1 day, the biggest bottleneck they had, that offshore processing team, is now effectively gone. They don't rely on an outsourced team. All of that is handled in automation. And the result of that is, Joe, if you just finish building out the slide, it is, one more click, it was a huge reduction of costs internally. All of the people that required to staff this, the paying for an offshore, team of people just to manually manage the paper. All right, and increased security is probably a huge thing, because nobody is touching these accounts. Nobody's looking at them unless you're inspecting the logs. Nobody's actually going in and looking at the data. Nobody who's physically had their hands on a piece of paper with account numbers on it. And certainly the byproduct is this increased speed all around. So, a huge impact to their bottom line to the business. Customer satisfaction. No longer is it, take 2 weeks to update your payment accounts into your mortgage, but something that's a sub a day. Get rid of the offshore team, and so you can see you're not really changing the process. We talked about this a little bit. So RPA is about is about automating the end-to-end process. It's not about changing what your process is. It's enforcing that just because you are doing these things, that you're not cutting corners, and the security still happens, and all these things. And nothing about the gray box at the bottom reflects that the process is different. It's just there's nobody touching it. You put the form in, and automation takes care of everything, with that last little blue box being the exception. Where things don't fit in well, they've got a day or so of some manual exceptions that they have to process with a very small onshore team.
Okay.
So this was hugely meaningful for them, and then since then they've just exploded their use cases outside of this line of business, everything else. But just wanted, this is such a huge, meaningful example that it's worth sharing.
Okay, thanks a lot, Eric. So let me quickly go through another use case too. And I picked onboarding. It's really a great example, and it's actually one of the things that most of our customers inevitably zero in on in one form or fashion, right? And I think it's a great example to kind of cover the highlights of this, because it's a great example of IT and non-IT systems, process, and people crossing paths, right? So there's really two themes I want to focus on, two disciplines that onboarding really highlights. One is evolving your automation, and then the other big piece is expecting and accepting change. So the way that I think of this is really there's kind of two dimensions. You know, there's the scope, which I'll consider the width of coverage. So how many steps, how many things are we doing, and how do you evolve that? And then there's the depth, which I'll get to next, right? But you know, if you look at this workflow, this is a simple example of an onboarding process that Greenlight's built internally. It's relatively straightforward. We're a smaller organization, but we set up our Office 365 account. We configure our CenturyLink, VoIP connection. We use Harvest for time tracking. And the part that makes this deceptively simple is we put everything else in the service management bucket, right? So the idea is that we, identify the tasks. Some customers we work with have done a lot of this inside the service management domain. A lot of them have checklists, and a lot of them have less than that. But the elegance of trying to do this is we've slowly picked out the things that we could automate and rolled them out one at a time and treated them, as Chris alluded to earlier, as single stacks, single approaches, right? And we do individual flows for each one of those, right? So in Office 365, we're creating a new employee, and we can create another flow that accounts for contractors or interns or things like that. And then we can swap out solutions. I'll talk to that a little bit more, but we used to use Join Me in our process, and now we don't, and I'll talk more to that, right? The stuff in SMACs, that we use, service management, could be ServiceNow, whatever your service management solution is. We're using that as our backlog, if you will, of things to automate and pull out. So we're working on Sonatrol as our access control vendor, automating that in the onboarding process, as well as HelpSide, our HR piece. So we'll slowly pull these manual tasks, manual things people are doing, and as we automate, we'll just continue to add to that. So that's, some good examples around is how we automate the scope of it. The next topic really is around depth. And when I talk about depth, I'm really talking about functionality after core works, right? So add a new employee drives, add a new contractor, add a new intern, right? We really strive to try and Pareto these processes out. We also really strive to not do big bang. We try to add value as quickly as possible. Things like onboarding begets offboarding, offboarding begets voluntary offboarding versus involuntary, involuntary offboarding. And for the sake of simplicity, we start with more flows. Well, I'm gonna try and keep going here. So again, we'll make flows that are very specific around employee versus intern versus contractor. And then sometimes we'll collapse that into one big Uber flow. But a lot of times, for the sake of simplicity and speed and cleanliness, we will stick with multiple flows. Another example of depth is how we roll these things out within the context of RPA. You can see here, this is the debug mode. This is how the engineers test and see how things are going. We're typically using real data to test and go through that. Then the next step we take is, this is the out-of-the-box self-service portal that is part of the RPA solution. It's very easy to configure, very easy to use, and this is where we start to engage the end users. And so here, in the example of onboarding, we've got this group, we've got the function, and we've got the form that fills out. And so we will typically take our customers and use that as kind of the intro to the end users and the UAT guys that need to sign off on this. And then really for production, we're going to roll this into your service management solution. Our personal, Greenlight's philosophy on this is ultimately a lot of these processes ought to be inside your service management solution. So this is our SMACs portal that we would use and go from there. Let's see. Let's go to some other things around the depth side, right? So I'm calling out running out of licenses. You know, this is a really simple example, but the theme is error handling, right? You know, you go to provision a license with, say, Harvest or Office 365, and you have a fixed number of licenses. It's not going to work because you don't have any licenses to deploy, right? So part of the depth of this is building out those error handling things, which is typically a mix of known and unknown issues, right? The HR form for an intern may be different than an employee. The other thing that you run into is, you know, building out, you know, we'll call them APIs, or, you know, little pieces of code that if you create a new user and in that login, you know, Jim.Smith is already taken, that's your standard, what's the plan B? So it's building out those things that give it resiliency and allows you to extend it. That's a big piece of it, right? The other piece I wanted to call it was compliance. This is really making sure that when you're doing things, that the roles, settings, age outs, all the things that are done are according to your governance guidelines. But the reason why I call this out as the last step, and I recognize the conflict in this, is approvals are such a big part of automation, and especially around things like anything touching HR, that it significantly impacts flow, order flow, and timing. And a lot of times what we run into is there are defined policies, and then there's all sorts of exceptions. So trying to account for that and automate that really has to be something that you kind of do downstream to make sure that you don't lose sight of the core piece of it. Actually, I'm going to stop here for a second and, you know, make sure that you guys understand that I present this as art, right? There is, you know, yellow and blue make green, so there's some, you know, technical aspect to this, but really the challenge, and one of the challenges with this space, is there's a lot of ways to get from point A to point B, and this has just been our experience of how we address these things. I think last major theme here is expect change. There's no news there, but it's interesting how much you run into both external, whether it's fields and forms, it's your upstream service provider in whatever manner that is, changing things on you. And then there's the internal changes, right? Within your own organization, people come and go, processes evolve. So you really just have to expect that. I alluded to this a little bit earlier. You know, one of the things that happened with this whole COVID thing was you hear in the media a lot about Zoom, but it really feels like in 90 days, the world went from a bunch of different IM solutions to everybody's on Teams. So we had Join Me, we dropped that Lego, and now our IM Teams functionality gets, you know, delegated as part of that. So we were able to change that. Another example is, you know, Office 365 has changed. They changed field names, they changed workflow, they changed service names. It used to be E3, E5, now it's Business Premium, Business Standard, right? Or, you know, their workflow for adding a new user has changed in the time that we started doing this, and some of the variable types are no longer drop-down boxes, they're check boxes. Again, you know, not a bad thing or a good thing, but just a reality that you have to expect that you're going to have to make sure that your upstream issues are accounted for, and you should plan for change there. So I guess that was it. I realized we're over. I don't know, Paul or Eric, I haven't been paying attention. Are we want to wrap up here? Any questions?
No, I think we're good. I've been answering a few as we've been going through the last few parts of this, so I don't see anything like that we didn't address.
Okay. Well, listen, I want to respect everyone's time and wrap up here. One thing I did want to call out is Vivit does these espresso talks, and you can find them on their podcast, or basically have a podcast channel. You can find that on their community calendar. Here's a sample of things that are out there recorded that you can get access to immediately. And then finally, I want to just thank you guys for your time. You should be getting the recorded link and the slides here shortly. Within 24, 48 hours, the dining cards will be sent out. Here's our email addresses if you have any questions. And again, I appreciate everyone staying, and I love the questions. So I think I'll wrap it up.